Hello guys, this is Kevin from Lowlands Wargaming, and today, as you can see, we're going to talk about the Easterlings. This is an in-depth video about the army of the Easterlings, where we're going to talk about their units, their choices, the Legendary Legion, and all of their options and tactics from a competitive standpoint. So if you're really interested in the new hotness that is the Dragon Emperor, or you're just curious about what you can do when you're facing up against one, then this is the video for you. Let's get started. Before we begin, one final disclaimer. Of course, this is all my opinion as a player. Like, I am quite experienced with the Easterlings. I started playing them intensely when the first teaser of the Acolytes were revealed. And I have quite a positive win record on tournaments. I took them to Articon, the latest Articon. I did quite well with them there. But again, I'm not a perfect human being, so you might disagree with me. And if you do disagree with me, well, please let us know in the comments. I'll be happy to start that discussion with you. So let's dive into the heroes, and who else to begin with than the Dragon Emperor. The Dragon Emperor is the new key centerpiece model for the Easterlings that was recently released with the Defense in the North supplement. With all of these models, I'm going to go over the stats really quick. Like, you can look these up yourself as well, but just so that we know what we're talking about. And then I'll go over my opinion of the model and why it's a good unit or not. So the Dragon Emperor, 170 points, which buys you a hell of a lot. Like, it's a fight 6 hero, 3 attacks, 3 wounds, 3 fate, 3 will, 3 might. Like, it's got 3s in all the right places, as they like to say, their friends over at the Green Dragon podcast. But he's so much more than just a big hero. He's of course riding on the palanquin. Now, the palanquin is this giant banner of 12 inches with a 6-inch bubble that increases the fight value of Easterling units nearby. Not heroes, just the warriors, just like Brorgir. And the palanquin is represented by the 6 wound total that will also make strikes if you happen to win the combat. He's got some special heroics that he can do. He can do strike, resolve, challenge, and defense. Now, challenge is a bit of a meme. Nobody ever uses it in a competitive setting for a good reason. But the other 3 are all really useful in the right situations, especially strike. You'll find yourself using a lot of the time. Now, is the Dragon Emperor a good unit? Of course it is. The Dragon Emperor and his Legion are incredibly powerful. He's hard to play properly, but he's also really hard to play wrong. Like, you just chuck him in the center of your army, he buffs the entire army, and away you go. But it's also deceptively easy for you to misplay him, to put him in the wrong position at the wrong time, so that he's not effective, or he's buffing the wrong guys, or maybe he's even out of line of sight of some key models. Now, in my opinion, the Dragon Emperor is pretty much exactly what the Easterlings needed to become competitive, but he did not do that by himself. But that's another hero that we'll talk about later that I think actually did a better job at making the Easterlings more competitive than the Emperor himself did. So what else does the Emperor have? Because he already has a lot, but he's got even more. He's got resistance to magic. He's got an elven-made weapon, which has a few tricks up its sleeve, and he's got a board white standfast, which also affects heroes. So as long as the Emperor is alive and on the field, he's a hero of legend. He'll pass his first courage test. He's got a really high courage. He's got some will left over. If your opponent hasn't cast a bunch of magic at him, he's not going to run away. And as long as he doesn't run away, the rest of your army doesn't run away, which makes you incredibly resilient in the late stages of the game. Now, the elven-made glaive lets you shield even when you're on a palanquin, which is incredibly useful if you get ambushed by something. And once he's on foot, it also allows him to spear support to get that cheeky fight 6 into a fight where your opponent wasn't expecting it. Now, of course, he won't be on foot very often because that banner is very nice to have, but it might be in your advantage to dismount him manually in order to get the extra bodies from the palanquin on a key objective in the later stages of the game, or when your opponent has a bunch of siege engines and will probably dismount him anyways. You might as well do it early so that you don't lose all of those bodies attached to the palanquin. So that's it for now on the Emperor. I think it's an incredibly powerful model. A lot of people think he's undercosted for what he does. I think he's decently balanced. He's probably undercosted for what he does on paper, but the Easterling army as a whole needed a bit of a buff in order to become competitive, and the Emperor and his Legion have done just that, and it made him quite a viable option for a competitive player. Now, for the second hero, is actually my favorite hero of the Easterlings, is not the Emperor, it's Brorgir the Conjurer. For 80 points you get an excellent magician, has some really useful spells. He's got Blade Wrath on a 2+, Fury on a 3+, Enchanted Blades on a 4+, and finally, and most importantly, Tremor on a 5+. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, Tremor lets you pick an enemy model within 6 inches of Brorgir. It goes off on a 5+. If it goes off, it hits the target, and anything in a straight line away from the target and Brorgir for d6 inches, or if you channeled it, 2d6 inches. They'll get a strength 6 hit and they'll be knocked prone, which is incredibly powerful, and usually will hit like 3 to 4 models with a cast of Tremor. Or if you're lucky and have a good setup, even more. Now, Brorgir also has a special rule which lets him regain will if he casts a spell on a natural 6, pretty much the same as when you're resisting a spell. This is really useful because he has 5 will. It will usually happen maybe once during one of your games, sometimes even more often if you're lucky. This will let you be a little bit more reckless with spending your will if you really need something to go off on a 6 because the enemy hero will likely try to resist it. Then just chuck 3 will at it and hope for a 6, and you get 1 will back, and it's become quite hard for them to try and resist it. Now, finally, and something that a lot of people know about Brorgir or utilize properly about Brorgir, he does have a 2-handed axe. And with the Emperor Legendary Legion bonus, he can reroll the 1 attack roll, so he can actually be quite useful. Just send him into combat against normal warriors, do that piercing strike 2-handed attack, and suddenly he can actually chop down, well, quite reliably. And if he's already used all of his will on spells, you might as well, because he's not worth anything anymore. Unless, of course, you're playing an assassination or fog of war kind of scenario where he might be worth a lot of victory points. So in my opinion, Brorgir single-handedly made the Easterlings a viable option for competitive play. I've played the Easterlings before the Emperor was released with just Rutabi, Brorgir and Khamul in an army at 750 points, and I did quite well with it. Just the option of having this Tremor to disrupt enemy lines, to deal the damage, these things that the Eastlings have struggled so much with historically, really help the army out a lot and give you this much needed interaction in the movement phase, where normally you'd be a very static army that just marches up and fights and then hope they win combats and the enemy dies. And now you can actually have a bit more tools at your disposal to really, you know, mess with the enemy. And honestly, personally, I usually use the Will of Brorgir almost exclusively on Tremors, but the fact that you have access to Blade Wrath or Fury if you really need it against terror-causing foes makes him just a really flexible hero to include in your army. And for me personally, he's an auto-take if I'm running Easterlings. No matter the points level, I want Brorgir in my army list. So it's like Drum, Brorgir, and then probably Emperor depending on points level or something else. Now, next up is the other hero I just mentioned, and also new since the Defense of the North supplement, is Rutabi. Rutabi for 110 points gets you a formidable infantry hero with defense 7, 3 wounds, 2 fate, 2 will, and 3 might, and Master of Battle on a 3+. Moreover, if she is up against somebody who is trapped, she can re-roll all failed wounds. So not only is she doing double strikes, she's also re-rolling everything that fails. So whatever was trapped is probably dead. Now, Rutabi is a perfect leader if it weren't for the Emperor. Like, before the Emperor was released and Rutabi came onto the field, I'm like, oh wow, this is exactly the infantry hero that you need in the center of your pike block. You get Master of Battle, you get like a bunch of might. It's really nice having this defense 7, making her really hard to kill. And if you're bringing Khamul, again, before the Legion, she could be your leader, because Khamul is kind of fragile and Rutabi, not so much. What do I think about Rutabi? Well, I mean, I think she's an excellent hero. She's just overshadowed a little bit by the Emperor. You would only really bring Rutabi if you have room for both. Or if you're playing Eastlings outside of the Legendary Legion and you don't want to bring the Emperor for whatever reason, then Rutabi might be a good pick. But personally, I think Rutabi shouldn't see play unless you're at 700, maybe even 750 points, where you get to the point where you can take the Emperor, you can take Brorgir, and you still have space left for another big hero, in which case you would take Rutabi to round out your force, and then she will do a lot of work. Now that's for the named heroes in the Legion. Of course, there's also 3 unnamed heroes that you can take in the Legendary Legion. Well, let's talk about the regular Dragon Priest first. And we're done with talking about the regular Dragon Priest. It's worthless compared to Brorgir. If you want to take a priest, just pay the extra 20 points and take Brorgir. He's so much better that it's not even worth talking about the regular priest, sadly. The only thing of note that you can do with the regular priest that Brorgir can't do is you can chuck him on a horse. But still, with only 3 will, worse casting values, and most importantly, worse casting range, because Blade Wrath only has a 6-inch range rather than the 12-inch that Brorgir has, there really isn't any reason to take the priest even on the horse, especially on the horse, because then you might as well just have paid 5 points more and got Brorgir instead. So that's it for the Dragon Priest, which leaves us with the captains and the Dragon Knights. Now the captains, I think, actually are a really underestimated option for the Easterlings, and normally a lot of people are really a fan of putting any hero that can take a horse on a horse. But personally, I think, especially in the Legion, you should just take a captain and put him on foot and don't even give him a shield. Now there's a reason for this. Of course, let's talk about the unit first. It's your run-of-the-mill captain. He's got 1 higher fight than the regular warrior, which puts him at 5-4. He's got 1 higher defense than a regular warrior, which puts him against at defense 6 or 7 if you're taking a shield. He's got 2 might, 1 will, 1 fate, and he has heroic march. Now march is very useful to have if you have a very shooty opponent and you want to close the distance. You can call up march, you can drum at the same time, and suddenly your army is moving twice as fast. Having infantry cross the board at 12 inches per turn is very, very fun to do. Now, why do I think the captain should be on foot in the Legendary Legion? Well, it's simple. On horse he's at 5-4, on foot he's at 5-5, because you can put a Black Dragon pikeman behind him who gets a boost from the Emperor, and then suddenly he's fighting at 5-5. He also gets rerolls from the Legion, and he can piercing strike in 2-handed, which suddenly makes him quite a killy option. And all that for just 50 points, which also gives you 2 might to call heroic moves with, so that your Emperor can save his might for other heroic actions. Especially I think at like the 600, 650 point level, which is quite popular thanks to Articon right now. Personally, I would take a captain as my third hero and just get more bodies on the field, which all will benefit from the massive banner and buffs from the Emperor. Now, last and not least, we of course have the Dragon Knights that you can take in the Legendary Legion. And the interesting thing about the Dragon Knights in the Legion is that their warband also gets the Black Dragon upgrades for free. Now, Dragon Knight costs 65 points or 80 on an armored horse. They have 3 attacks and 2 wounds, 2 might, blood and glory, and that's about it. They don't have will, they don't have fate, which makes them incredibly fragile. And also the reason why recently I started playing less and less with Dragon Knights, because when you're up against opponents who know what they're doing, or really competitive players, they will often have tools in their arsenal. They won't just bring a run-of-the-mill army with just, you know, straightforward front to back shield walls and let's clash against each other and see what happens. No, they will also bring some kind of magic, some kind of interaction, some kind of trick to really disrupt one of your key units. And the Dragon Knight's always going to be the target, because he's fragile, he's very scary, but he's also very easily disposed of. And there's not much you can do about it, because the Dragon Knight doesn't even have any will to resist magic, and he doesn't have any fate to, you know, try and save any wounds that he's taking. So quite often I find myself just baiting something out with the Dragon Knight, then the Dragon Knight dies, and he ends up not actually accomplishing a whole lot during the game. So for the points that you have to spend, like 80 points, I think it's better off if you just take a captain on foot, which also has significant killing power thanks to the 2-handed weapon, and then you just have 30 points that you can spend on more warriors, which gives you like 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 more models, depending on how the points work out. So that's it for the heroes that you can take in the Legendary Legion. But of course, the Eastlings have 2 more heroes, but those have kind of been left behind because they're no longer featured, or well, they're not featured in the Legendary Legion. And of course, I'm talking about the OG hero of the Eastlings, Amdur, and the Ringwraith sidekick, or the Ringwraith version of the Eastlings, is Khamul the Easterling. Now, Amdur used to be the main reason why somebody would take Eastlings. It's a really good hero. Like, there's no way about it. He's got fight 6, he's got an Elven-made weapon, he's got 3 attacks. Does it start sounding familiar? Yeah, it's basically like the Dragon Emperor, but at a cheaper points level, but with less abilities that buff the rest of your army. So Amdur is still a solid hero, but he costs a lot of points. If I remember correctly, he's like 130 points and 145 mounted, which makes him significantly more expensive than Rutabi, but in my opinion not that much better, because he doesn't do that much for the rest of your army. Sure, he's got this 3-inch banner which can increase to 6 inches if he kills the enemy hero. He's got like 3 counter strikes if the enemy calls a strike and whatever. He's got blood and glory, so it makes him a really good assassin, but it doesn't necessarily make him a very good leader for your forces. And there's not a whole lot of reason to take him over the Emperor. And if you're taking the Emperor anyways, you're going to take the Legion, and if you're taking the Legion, you can't even take Amdur. So sadly, he's been kind of left behind because of the way the Legendary Legion turned out. Now, if you were allowed to take him in the Legendary Legion, I think he would be an interesting option, but I'm not sure I would take him over Brorgir or Rutabi either, because I just think those heroes do more for the amount of points that they cost. Again, Amdur is kind of expensive, and with the Emperor already taking up 170 points of your army, you kind of need to cut corners where you can, so you can get more bodies in to make use of the Emperor buffs. Now lastly, there's Khamul, and this is the model that I'm really sad about, because I love Khamul. I played him a lot in Eastlings before the Emperor came out. He's 120 points, or well, realistically, he's 170 points because you're always taking a Fell Beast on him. And he does a lot for the army. Similarly to Brorgir, he gives you that much needed interaction. The compels, the transfixes, the threatening of the hurl, 17-inch movement if you're drumming and having fly. It's a really key centerpiece model that will allow you to really terrorize your opponent, and he would combine really, really well with Rutabi when he's not your leader and can really go off and do his thing. But again, you don't see him as much because he's not in the Legendary Legion. Now, later when we're talking about list building, I'll double back on this and discuss whether or not you could consider playing Eastlings outside of the Legendary Legion just so you can play Khamul. But for now, I think everybody agrees that Khamul simply isn't the right choice because you miss out on the Legendary Legion bonuses. So that's it for the heroes. Of course, we also have the humble troops to discuss. The Easterling army isn't very big, like it only has a few model types. It's got the basic warriors where your options are you can have a sword, well you always have a sword, you can have a shield and a pike, or you can have a bow or any combination thereof if you want to do a conversion. And you can potentially upgrade them to black dragons for a +1 fight and a +1 courage. Basically, your Easterling warriors are the same as warriors of Minas Tirith, except they have pikes and they don't have shield wall. That's basically it. Where they start shining is, you know, the 3 Black Dragon upgrades from the Legendary Legion, and then of course the fight buffs from the Emperor and the rerolls, where suddenly they become quite powerful, especially combined with this pike block formation, which lets you really leverage your numbers against the opponent, especially in tightly cramped places. Now, Easterling warriors can also take bows, but you never take bows because their shooting is absolutely awful. They shoot on a 4+ and it's strength 2. Why bother? Just take more bodies with shields or pikes or both, and just move them forward with your forces. If you need to leave a model behind on an objective, okay, just leave a Black Dragon pikeman there. Who cares? If you really want to be cheeky, you can take like a single bowman to leave behind on an objective, but personally I wouldn't even bother because you're not ever going to do anything with that bow anyways. The Easterling army is a really one-dimensional army in that it drums forward, it meets the enemy and it starts fighting. Shooting isn't really part of the game plan. If you're trying to be cheeky and shoot, maybe you're playing the wrong army. Now, the recent addition, well, 2 additions actually with Defense of the North, but the first is the Acolytes. The Acolytes are a very interesting model. At 11 points, they give you 2 attacks. They give you throwing daggers, fight 4, really low defense, and they have these ninja abilities where they might not get knocked prone. They can ignore barriers when they're striking. They get +2 on their climb tests and stuff, which makes them a very interesting option for skirmishing. Now, in my opinion, Acolytes, you either go all out on them or you take none at all. If you take like maybe just 3 to try and do clever cheeky things, you'll find that your opponent will just prioritize them with shooting or other shenanigans and they just die before they do anything, because they're suddenly the weakest link in your entire army at defense 4, whereas the rest of your army is defense 6 or higher. But if you go all out on the acolytes, then yes, you'll lose a few of them going in, but now suddenly you still have quite a few left on your front rank going into the enemy, and you're rolling 4 attacks plus a reroll against whatever they're charging, because you'll have 2 pikes behind them. Now yes, they don't have the phalanx special rule, so if you put 2 pikes behind them, then they can get trapped because the second pike can't make way, but usually you'll be able to spread out your lines just far enough so that they can squeeze in through the gaps and make it way anyway. And of course the acolytes will let you do ninja shit, so you can basically climb rocks and jump over them and suddenly be on top of a building and throwing daggers down at your opponent, which can be very annoying to have to deal with if you're in a tournament game and suddenly you're being thrown to pieces by daggers from a place that you can't reach easily with your warriors. It can also be a bit of a trap. Don't over-invest into this. Don't climb onto something just for the sake of climbing onto it, because it will also take you an extra turn to get down from there, and suddenly your acolytes could be out of position when your enemy is just like, yeah, I'm just not going to go near to that, I'm going to go this way instead. Now lastly, and the only model not featured on this table, because there simply isn't a model for them yet, there is the Runish Wardrake. 20 points for a dragon-ish model, defense 5, 2 attacks, strength 5 off the top of my head. He rerolls all wounds, it's got like a special venom rule, etc, etc. We haven't really seen it much in tournaments yet, simply because there isn't a model for it yet. Officially there's not really been a base size released for them either, although unofficially I've heard that it's probably 40 mil, and it makes most sense for it to be on the same size as a cavalry base. Personally, I don't expect these to be very good. Yes, they give you some killing power, but they lack one crucial thing, and that's the Easterling keyword. They will not be affected by the drum, they will not get the +1 fight bonus from the Emperor, they will get banner rerolls because that's just a generic banner, but they miss a lot of the things that you need in order to make, you know, the army work. It's not a unit that synergizes very well with the rest of the army. The Easterling army is all about drumming forward and getting into key positions quickly, and if you have this chunky beast kind of lagging behind, that doesn't really help you. So that's it for the warriors. Of course, actually, there's also the cataphracts to talk about. The cataphracts are the Easterling cavalry option. These are the units where, in my opinion, you always take the Black Dragon upgrade, even if you have to pay 2 points for it. They have an interesting special rule where they can get shield wall on a horse, so your horse can suddenly be defense 6 and your rider can be defense 7 if you put them in like little triangles, which is kind of cheeky. But what the cataphracts are most well known for is, of course, the drum option, which should be your first inclusion in any Easterling army list that you make for obvious reasons. Now, how many cataphracts should you bring in the army? We'll talk about that in list building, but the honest answer is not many, just enough so that you can contest objectives and countercharge enemy heroes when you need to. So that's it for the units. Let's go on to how to play the Easterlings. Now, if you're a more experienced player, you might want to skip the first bit of it. We'll put timestamps in the video description. Because first I'll be talking about the basic premise of the Easterling army and how to play it, and later on in the video I'll go into more niche tips on things you can do or might not have considered when playing the Easterlings. Alright, so let's talk about the army bonus of the Easterlings before we dive into how to play them. The army bonus itself for the army, not the Legendary Legion, is quite straightforward. If you're broken, you get +1 courage on everyone. And if the game ends before you want it to, which is in scenarios where the game can end on a 1 or 2 when the army breaks, then you can force a reroll once during that game. This can be, quite useful. Obviously, it'll let you be a bit more risky. Let's say your opponent has taken the objectives, but you can kind of piecemeal kill one part of their army and then and thereby breaking them, and then go for the objective. You can do so a little bit more reliably because there's only a 1 in 9 chance that the game will end on the first turn of breaking, because they need to roll that 1 or 2 times in a roll. Of course, once you've used the reroll and you don't get any more, now is the time that you really need to start hurrying, because suddenly that 1 in 9 chance has become a 1 in 3 chance, and suddenly the game could end the next turn. So it's something that is useful, but honestly, personally, it hasn't come up a whole lot in my tournament play, because most of the time I'm either ahead really far when the game can end, or I'm behind far enough that the reroll won't really matter, and only increases the chances of me getting tabled with the regular Eastlings. Now, let's talk about the Legendary Legion bonuses, which, as you know, usually replace the army bonuses, except in this case they don't. You get to keep the army bonus. In addition, there's two bonuses that you get with the Legendary Legion. First off, in the Emperor's Warband and in the Dragon Knight's Warbands, the Black Dragon upgrade is free. So you don't have to pay 2 points per model. You simply just make everybody a Black Dragon. You don't care. As long as you have the models for it, you do it because it's just better. It's an extra fight, it's extra courage, it's just great. Which also makes your army list much more efficient. The second benefit is that all of your heroes in your entire army, in a dual roll, they get to re-roll one of their dice. I call it Lord of the East because it's kind of like Lord of the West. You get a free re-roll, and if you're in range of a banner, which, hello, you usually are, then you get another reroll, so you actually get 2 rerolls per duel. So the Emperor will always have 5 dice to try and win a fight, and if you're shielding, you effectively have 8 dice to try and win a fight. Same thing with Rutabi. Rutabi suddenly has 5 dice to try and win a fight. Brorgir is only on 1 attack, but can do a reroll, and if they have a pike support, the pike gets a banner effect as well. So suddenly you can really stack these rerolls and, you know, make the odds in your favor. Now, how do you use the Legendary Legion bonuses? Honestly, there's not really much thinking about it. The rerolls are nice. The free Black Dragon upgrades are nice. It makes the army building just much easier and just kind of smooths out the points. You put units that aren't Black Dragon in Brorgir's Warband, you put the other ones in the Emperor's Warband, and that way you can kind of squeeze out a few more points and get like 1 or 2 extra models that you otherwise wouldn't have. Now, some people think that the Legion bonus of free Black Dragons is way too overpowered and makes them way too cheap. It's nice, it's good, but I don't think it's overpowered, because normally you would only make your back rank of pikes Black Dragons, and so in any given army you would have maybe 6 to 12 of them, depending on how large it is, so it effectively saves you 12 to 24 points. It's not that much, it's basically 2 to 3 models extra that you get. But what it does do is it removes a lot of headache, because now suddenly there's no penalty to it. You can take a lot of Black Dragons and you no longer have to be really careful, like, oh, is there a Black Dragon in this fight? Is there a Black Dragon in the back rank? You're just like, no, like 2/3 of my army is Black Dragon. I don't even have to worry about it. I always have someone in a fight somewhere. So that's basically Legendary Legion bonuses. I think they're really good. I don't think they're game breaking. And I don't think they're good enough that if you really want to play Amdur or Khamul, that you're too punished for not doing it. But the Emperor is so good, and Brorgir and Rutabi are so good, that there's no real reason to not play them, and therefore there's not much reason to never take the Legion. You just always do it and you enjoy the benefits that you get from it. So let's go over how to play the Easterlings. First, I'll go over some general tactics. So if you're a more experienced player, these will be pretty obvious to you. You might want to skip ahead to the more niche tactics. But this is really aimed for the person that's not yet played the Easterlings, or not yet played against them, or is maybe still learning the game. Now, first of all, when you're starting a game with your Legendary Legion, you always want to identify your win condition. What's the objective? What is worth the most victory points? Can you compete on this objective, or is your opponent's army list likely to beat you on it? Like games like Assassination might be really hard for you if your hardest hitting hero is simply a captain on foot that isn't like your leader. Same thing with Fog of War. You might be on the back foot if your opposing player has brought a list that just does the objective a lot better than you do. But any objective that or game that includes holding an objective on the field and also has banner VPs and has leader wounds or leader kill VPs, you'll be good at, because you have a banner and you have a leader that's really hard to hit and damage, because he just has so much dice, he has got high defense, etc. You'll be pretty favored. So try and see what your opponent has, try to see what your objectives are, and formulate a plan in your head like, okay, this is going to be my plan to go for the win. I'll probably get 8 victory points, and my opponent will probably be able to score 3 to 5. That's good enough, you're winning. So yeah, if you think you can't win the main objective, but you have a shot at keeping your opponent from claiming the main objective, then it's a very realistic tactic to just try and break them or get the leader wound and win that way. Even a win by 1 or 2 victory points is still a win if you think that gives you the largest chance to win the game over trying to compete for the main objective of the scenario. You know, games like Retrieval, you know, the Capture the Flag scenario, Storm the Camp, things like that. Sometimes it's just better to not try to play the objective and focus on the side objectives instead. Now, that being said, how do you actually play this army? Well, the basic premise of the army is ridiculously simple. You have your Emperor, you put him somewhere in the middle of your entire line, you have a drummer on a cataphragm behind, your opponent is somewhere else, they're maybe trying to defend an objective, or you're trying to beat them to a central objective or something like that. You bang on the drum for a turn or two, you move into a good position and you start fighting. You start grinding it out because you have more rerolls, you have higher fight value most of the time, and you'll just win most of your fights and slowly kill them until they break, and eventually the game ends and you should be on the objective because you had higher mobility at the start of the game. Now, that's the basic premise of the army. Obviously, you know, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. Things will change and you'll have to adapt in order to still maintain that lead over your opponent. There's a few more things, of course, to playing this army, and the most important thing is to just take advantageous fights. Now, I'll get some models out to represent our enemy over here. So let's get ourselves some evil men from Minas Tirith that need to be vanquished. Let's say you're playing against another army that is high defense, has a shield wall, and they have a lot of models. Because you're in a pike block formation, there's a good chance that their line is actually wider than yours. And there's a good chance that they might envelop you if you just go in head on. So this is a very basic premise. Let's say your opponent has a shield wall twice as wide as yours. You have a pike block formation, the Emperor is off to the side somewhere. And so what do you do in this instance? If you just charge them head on one, and you charge them like this, then the enemy can just wrap around, tag off things, maybe trap your models, and you'll start losing that way. What you should be doing instead is try to find a terrain piece to sit inside, and then even on a turn that you don't, you lose priority and your opponent charges you, if you have your models spaced out a little bit like this, suddenly it's very hard for them to get past them, and they'll have no other choice than to charge them like this. Now, why is this an advantageous fight for you? Well, even if they have spear supports, let's say that they have so many models that they can put 4 models into one of your warriors. So basically you're fighting with 3 models against 4 of theirs. You're probably still winning this because you have the Emperor somewhere nearby. You get a banner reroll which equalizes the amount of dice in the fight, and you'll have the higher fight value thanks to your Black Dragons being fight 5, and now suddenly your opponent will lose most of the fights. Now, when they lose a fight, you get to use 3 dice to try and kill them. If you're lucky, you can take out 2 of their models, but even if they win, at most they'll be able only to take out 1 of your models. So you really have to try and use your pikes efficiently to keep your models out of combat but still fighting as much as you can. Now, other than that, I think the main thing that you need to worry yourself about when you're playing the Legion is to not give VPs away by letting your Emperor get killed too easily or wounded too easily. So yes, let him fight alongside your troops, give him some space to do some work, but don't let your opponent get the opportunity to dive in with a big hero and some other troops and suddenly trap him and kill him. He is really durable, but at the same time he has a really big base, so if he's got out of position he can also be flash killed. And last but not least, I've talked about him already, and we have Brorgir the Conjurer, which I think is a cornerstone of any tactic that you should have. If we take this nice little Minas Tirith line, for instance, and the lines have well and truly clashed, let's say you win priority and your opponent doesn't call a rogue move, or you lose priority but you see an opportunity so you call a rogue move. If you left a gap for Brorgir, you can very easily just slide him through your pike line, call a tremor on this poor unfortunate soul, hit the entire line, and back off again. Now, tremor will knock prone all of these models and will kill about half of them because it's a strength 6 hit, and suddenly the entire line of the enemy is disrupted, and it will allow you to leverage your numbers and a higher fight value even more. Like, Brorgir will basically function as a can opener for the enemy line, and once you've got that hole, you go through, you envelop the enemy, you get those traps in, and suddenly you no longer struggle with killing things, even though you're strength 3 and your opponent might be defense 6, and you can kill them very, very easily from there. That's the basic premise of playing the Easterlings. Drum forward, get a good position, grind out against your enemy, play the objective, play the objective, play the objective, and prevent your opponent from getting victory points that way. So now that we've covered the basic way to play Easterlings, there's a lot of fine details to go over and these niche tips. Now, if you're an experienced player, you're a tournament veteran, this is the part of the video that you've been waiting for, and the part of the video where hopefully you'll learn something new. So I have a whole list. I'll just go through them one by one. The first few things are about the drum. So the drum obviously is a key piece of your army. You start with the drum in range of all of your dudes, and you start by drumming if you're not already in charge range. That much is obvious to anyone who's ever played Lord of the Rings. But what might be less obvious is what you do with the drum once you're done drumming. He can actually fill quite a few roles, and one of my favorite ones is just the drum as a bait. If the drum's no longer useful, he's basically just a cataphract, and you could put him somewhere in the open or maybe behind a single tree in the waste. You can draw out enemy shooting. Maybe you can even trick an opponent into overcommitting a hero to try and kill it with a hero combat or something like that. The drum isn't worth anything anymore if you don't want to use it. So that using the drum as a bait is a very, very nice tactic. But personally, I try to keep the drum around for two reasons. One is he is still a turbo objective carrier. If there's a game where there's a light object, if he drums, he still moves 15 inches. Nothing is going to catch him short of a flying creature that can cast Compel. So basically a Ringwraith on a Fell Beast. The other thing that I try to keep the drum around for is basically have him all the way behind enemy lines, or sorry, behind friendly lines, just so that your back pike rank is in range, and most importantly, Brorgir is in range. Now, having Brorgir have 9-inch movement rather than 6 means that it's so much easier to get a key tremor off, even on a maul that your opponent thinks is out of range after you move some other pikes out of the way or something like that. And that 9-inch movement on Brorgir and your pikes really lets you, readdress your lines much more clearly, because your pikes, they don't need to charge. They can just spear support even though they've been affected by a drum, and so there's no penalty in just using the drum on them.
What's next?
All right, next up, we've got some tips about Brorgir. Like, if you haven't noticed yet, I love Brorgir, okay? Brorgir is the can opener, he's the man, the myth, the legend. He's won me so many games, but there's quite a bit of, finesse in using Brorgir properly. The most important thing with Brorgir is to really decide what do you cast and when do you cast it. Like I mentioned earlier, Tremor is your spell of choice. It's usually the spell that you'll get most value off. Killing 2, 3, maybe even 4 models of the enemy and knocking a few others prone is really worth it, even if you have to spend 2 or 3 will or 2 will and a might or something like that to get it off. But Brorgir has other options. He of course is Fury. Now, using Fury is really simple. If your enemy has a lot of terror, you cast Fury. If they don't, you don't, because you don't need it even if you're broken, because you have high courage and you have the Emperor with a board wide standfast. Don't cast Fury if your opponent is not playing something like the Army of the Dead. Enchanted Blades is rubbish, you can forget about it, because Blade Wrath does pretty much the same thing on anyone that you cast it on, and it's easier to cast, so you can just roll 1 dice on it. So it really comes down to a choice between Blade Wrath or Fury, or sorry, Blade Wrath or Tremor most of the time, and there's only 1, maybe 2 scenarios in which Blade Wrath can be useful. One is when your Dragon Emperor has charged into a really tough to kill unit, like a giant troll or a really tough hero like Thor in the latest battle report. Then it can be worthwhile to cast Blade Wrath on the Emperor, or maybe even channel Blade Wrath, because not only the Emperor strikes at strength 6 or strength 10 because of Blade Wrath, also the Bearers strike at strength 6 or strength 10. If you don't believe me, check the most recent FAQs, they've cleared it up when somebody asked that question. So at one point do you cast a Blade Wrath other than on the Emperor? Well, if you're playing a Dragon Knight, it can actually be really valuable to cast it on a Dragon Knight, because a Dragon Knight actually sometimes struggles killing defense 7 units or defense 7 heroes because it's only strength 4. Same with the Emperor, but the Dragon Knight's got that knockdown, etc. So a Blade Wrath on the Dragon Knight on the charge can be actually a really powerful tool to suddenly flash kill something. So That's really the choices that you have on casting spells. Now what you can do on a turn where it can be viable to cast Blade Wrath, it could be interesting to call a heroic channel with Brorgir and force some mind games on your opponent. What you're going to do? Are you going to cast this Mega Tremor that can go up to 12 inches, or are you going to cast Blade Wrath on something and suddenly absolutely murder whatever you're fighting? It can cause some fun mind games, but honestly, personally, I've only really cast heroic channel once, maybe twice in tournament play, because usually there's a better use of your might with Brorgir. Now, what other fun things can you do with Brorgir? Don't be afraid to cast into heroes that only have one will. It only goes off on a 5+ anyway, so you cast it either on a 5 or a 6, which can be hard to resist if they're only rolling 1 dice at it to resist. So if you need to knock down a key hero, or maybe even cause a wound on them, just do it. Just cast that tremor, roll 3 dice on it, or roll 2 dice and spend a might on it to make sure it goes off. It can be quite worthwhile. Of course, it's a gamble, but in the right situation, it can be worth doing it. Similarly, you can use Tremor very defensively on the Emperor. Tremor will hit anything in the combat, so if you cast it on a unit that's fighting the Emperor and it goes off, everything in the combat goes prone. Everything in the combat gets a strength 6 hit. Now the Emperor doesn't care that much about the strength 6 hit, it's still a 5+ to wound, he's got some fate, so he'll probably be alright. You might take a wound on the Paladin, too bad. But importantly, the Emperor can't be knocked prone by it, so he'll just stay standing, but everybody else in the combat falls on their face. If he's been transfixed or he's been ambushed by something, Tremor could be the one thing that can save the Emperor from a certain fate. Similarly, you can also do it on Rutabi, and Rutabi has the same rule Amdur has, where on a 4+ he just stays on our feet, so even there it could be very interesting to cast Tremor into the combat. Now, because you can cast Tremor on low will heroes relatively reliably, you could also consider making Brorgir your assassin in games like Assassination. And just choose a hero that will probably be somewhere near the fighting, maybe not in the front lines, but has only one will. So what you do, you wait for a turn that you lose priority, your opponent has moved, then you move Brorgir, you cast Tremor on them, you knock them down, and then the next turn, even if they cast a heroic move or call a heroic move, they probably can't get away because they can only move 3 inches, and then Brorgir casts another Tremor, and if they don't save their fate and they're only 2 wound hero or something, you could actually flash kill a hero behind enemy lines just by using Tremors. Similarly, Tremor is also an excellent tool to just snipe enemy banners. If they leave it somewhere in the back of their line, just behind another model, you could just cast Tremor. It first kills the model in front of the banner, and then it kills the banner, and the banner can't be passed off to anyone, and suddenly that banner is gone. And if it's a game in which banner VPs matter, now suddenly you're ahead by 2 VPs, and you don't even need to play any other objective. If the game ends there and then, you've already won. So that's what Brorgir does for your army. Acolytes. I love these guys. They're amazing. They're amazing sculpts. They're actually a really good model if you have enough of them in your army list. But I see a lot of people playing them wrong. They have this special rule where they get +2 on climbing. They have throwing daggers. They could suddenly jump off a cliff and be behind enemy lines and stuff like that. This is all really, really powerful, but it's also a trap. Let's say your enemy has a shield wall behind the cliff. They lost priority, so you have to move first, and you decide to move your acolytes on top of the cliff, and you end your turn there because climbing is still difficult terrain, so you need your full movement to get on there. But next turn you could maybe jump down and charge them in the back or something. The enemy could just move away. They can just move out of the range of your throwing daggers. They can just ignore your acolytes and take up a different position, and now suddenly this group of warriors is really out of position and probably in a spot where they can get shot at by enemy bows or something like that. So you need to be really careful about this ability. It can be really powerful. You can really pull off some tricks that your opponent doesn't expect, but similarly you can also just lose the game because suddenly 80 points worth of models is now in a position where they're not going to do anything, and it'll take you a turn or two to get them back to your main force. They also are very squishy and they will die without support. And while they can do excellent parkour, your pikemen cannot. So if you really want to throw them into the back of enemy lines, make sure they get some support in some other way, because otherwise they're most likely just dying because of their low defense, especially if they are out of range of the Emperor fight and or banner bonus. So think twice about acolyte parkour, and if you're ever in doubt about whether it's worth it to send an acolyte up to a ruin or a building or a tree, If you're hesitating, just don't do it, just keep him on the ground. So next up, there's some neat little tricks about the Emperor. I already mentioned that you can shield with him. Don't forget this. If he's ever in a tough spot, just shield. Don't take the risk, just shield, get those 6 dice of 2 rerolls to force your opponent to roll a 6, and maybe they whiff and you get almost guaranteed the 6, and then suddenly they have to spend might or whatever to win the combat. So that's just a rule that you should really remember. Another thing that you can do with the Emperor that most people are aware of is, well, you can dismount. Suddenly the Emperor can go off his fancy seat and you get 6 of these shiny boys in return. These nice little black dragon warriors. But why would you ever want to do that? There's 2 reasons to do it. One is you need more bodies on an objective. It's plain and simple. Don't wait until the last turn of the game of doing it, because your opponent might still win priority or call a heroic move and tag the Emperor, and suddenly you can't dismount. Try to do a 1, maybe 2 turns before the last turn to make sure that you get it. At that point, a lot of the army will be dead. Losing the banner reroll and the fight bonus really sucks, but if you just shield a lot, you might still be able to hold out. Another reason why you might want to dismount the Emperor is if you're facing against siege engines. Siege engines are the only thing in the game that can dismount the Emperor, and if they have a direct hit on the Emperor, they can insta-kill the palanquin, which means you lose all of the guys under it. So if you think you're going to get hit by a siege engine anyway, I'm looking at you, Assault upon Helm's Deep, you might just want to, hedge your bets and dismount ahead of time and have those extra 6 models and just, live with the fact that you're not going to have your fancy banner and fight bonus in this game. It sucks. But it really is the lesser of 2 evils, because if you're up against Assault on Helm's Deep and they have 2 ballistas and they're always shooting at your Emperor, one of those shots is eventually going to connect and then you will lose the model. So that's about it for dismounting the Emperor. One thing that's very important with this army is to be skint with your might. Really save your might. That's the beauty of having a phalanx formation, this nice broad pike formation, is that if you lose priority and your opponent can charge you, you don't care. Just let them charge you. If you've done your job, if you've set up your line properly, you don't particularly care if they get to choose who goes into where, because you'll have good engagement anyways. You have more dice because of rerolls, you have higher fight value, you don't mind. So don't automatically call a heroic move if your opponent decides to call a heroic move when they lose priority. Sometimes you can just let them have it and then just live with the consequences, because you need your might elsewhere. So it's just really important, because if you spend a lot of might on calling moves, you probably are using that might with your Emperor, because he's your main sort of might in the list, unless you also bring Rutabi. And honestly, the Emperor needs his might to call strikes or maybe even defense to prevent losing wounds and giving away leader victory points. Now, of course, if you bring Rutabi into the army, it becomes even easier to hold on to your might, because if your opponent calls a heroic move, you might just get one for free with her Master of Battle. And now to talk about the biggest weakness of Easterlings historically. They have always struggled with D6 or even D7 opponents. The entire army is strength 3 other than the heroes, and of course the new Runish Wardrakes, which means that you always need to roll 6s in order to wound the opponent. Having a nice fight buff and whatever means that often you can feint, so one of your guys will reroll 1s to wound, but it's not really enough. So even if you have 3 pikes into an enemy, if you win the fight and you need 6 to wound, half of the time you still won't wound the enemy, and sometimes you roll more than 1 6, but you're only up against 1, so then you only kill 1 anyways. So killing power is really something Eastlings have struggled with, but there are actually a few options that you can use to alleviate this problem. I think the biggest one I've already talked about enough, and that's Brorgir. Tremor is strength 6 hits. Strength 6 warriors, defense 6 warriors really don't like getting strength 6 hits because they die on a 4+. So suddenly this nice shield wall that your opponent has is an absolute ruins as Tremor carves a line through it, and now you outnumber your opponent and you can start trapping them and just killing them by sheer weight of dice. Another thing that can reliably kill enemy troops that have D6 is quite simply your heroes. If you can make sure that your Emperor charges 2 warriors per turn, that's 2 dead warriors per turn. Similarly, Rutabi will do the same thing. A captain, I've talked about them before, a humble captain without a shield, 2-handed axe, piercing strike if you're up against the defense 7, suddenly you're winning on 4s. It does an amazing job at just reliably chopping away at enemy warriors. And then, of course, if all else fails, there's one thing that the Eastlings are really good at, and it's just grinding it out. You have the rerolls, you have the fight value, you have the numbers, just go shield wall to shield wall, and let the pure weight of dice eventually kill your opponent. But personally, this can really go either way. If you just fill the wound on the fights that you win, or you just happen to lose a few more fights than you should and take wounds, especially against something like Uruk-hai, who are strength 4 and wounding you back on 5s, it's a very dicey proposition, and it could really, you know, come back to bite you, as suddenly your warriors are disappearing and you can no longer outgrind your opponent. So what else can you do against this? Well, what I really like to do is axe swaps. As you can see, I've converted some of my cataphracts and some of my warriors to have axes. You can also do this on your acolytes. There is a rule in the rulebook that says that you can simply pay a point per warrior model to swap their swords or axes or whatever for any of the other hand weapons. And axes give you access to piercing strike, which lets you get up to strength 4 with your warriors. You know, of course, the downside is that your defense lowers whenever you use it. But if you're winning almost all of your fights anyway, thanks to, you know, a lot of dice, rerolls, and fight bonuses, then suddenly that downside isn't very big anymore. And if you can limit your exposure of models just to like 1 for every 2 of them because you have pikes behind you, then, you know, even if you lose the fight, you'll only lose 1 model. So it can be really worth it to invest those extra points in giving access to your front rank warriors. I would definitely recommend it on cataphracts because, you know, now they're fight 5 or at least fight 4 with a banner rerolls from like 12 inches away, and that piercing strike can really help them kill those annoying defense 6 warriors. Special mention to the acolytes. They already have low defense. They might already be trapped if they lose a fight if you didn't position them properly. They have 2 attacks, so they get twice the benefit. Axe swaps are definitely worth it on acolytes, and the nice thing is if you're up against a defense 7 or a defense 5 army where a piercing strike doesn't do anything with them, they still have a sword in the other hand. So at the start of the game you can say like, hey, I know I've given them axes, but they also still have a sword, so I'm choosing to use the sword for the combats, and they'll either stab or feint for their combats, and you still get that benefit. That's something the regular warriors don't have because they only have a sword, they don't have a dagger or anything. So if you swap that sword out, they're stuck with piercing strike and they can't use stab or feint anymore. Fortunately, the rest of your pikes, well, your pikes can still stab or feint. So there's one last thing to talk about with this army, and that's what to do when you can't deathball. Like, deathball is when all of your dudes are in one giant lump and they're stronger together, which is basically how the Eastlings play. But some scenarios just won't let you do that. I'm talking about Maelstrom, but I'm also talking about things like destroy the supplies or, you know, divide and conquer, where you're deployed apart. In those situations, you really need to consider, okay, what am I going to do with the Emperor? Where is he needed most, and how many warriors and other heroes need to send with him to achieve what he needs to do? And then what's the minimum amount of warriors and heroes that I need in the other places in order to hold the line just long enough for the Emperor to do the job? That's really what you have to do, because that's how this army plays. You don't spread out. You don't have some models everywhere and expect them to win, because like I mentioned in the introduction, your warriors are basically warriors of Minas Tirith. They're not that great. Like, even as Black Dragons, sure, they're fight 4, but they're strength 3, you know, they're good at not dying, and they might win a combat or 2, but they're not very good at killing. So they really need that, you know, fight bonus from the Emperor. They really need those heroes nearby to, you know, get the killing power. They really need, you know, the pike supports to get the most out of their models and things like that. So it really becomes a game of, how do I deploy? Where do I go? And how do I slow down my enemy in one area, which is probably just, you know, shielding a bunch. Until, you know, the Emperor and his followers can get the work done. So in Maelstrom scenarios, personally what I like to do is to deploy Brorgir first. Brorgir's warband is usually the weakest and most prone to getting gangbanged. So you want him on the board first so that you can see where the rest goes. Afterwards, I like rolling my secondary warband or my tertiary warband, whatever you want to call it, which is usually a captain or Rutabi, depending on points level. And only lastly, I'll roll the Emperor, because you want to try and get the Emperor where he's needed most. You might have to spend some might on it. He also has the drum with him, so you can, you're going to gauge, like, where do I need him, where do I need the drum, and then, you know, move into an ideal position. You basically want to maximize the amount of information you have before you deploy the Emperor. And if you can, you want to deploy, you know, your third hero together with Brorgir, so that Brorgir doesn't get absolutely swarmed by the enemy and just dies before you can get value out of him. Right, so that's about it for all of my tips and tricks. I might have forgotten a few extra spicy ones, but you'll just have to learn without them. I'm already putting a huge, risk on myself by telling you all of this and risking losing all of my games in the future. Now everybody knows how to play Eastlings and how to counterplay them. Let's talk about list building. So list building for Legendary Legion is incredibly easy. You take your Emperor, you take your Drum, and depending on points level, you take Brorgir. As soon as you can, you take him. So I think from 250 to 350 points, you just have an Emperor and a full warband with a drum in it and some, a whole bunch of black dragons and maybe a cataphract or some acolytes sprinkled in, like whatever. That's it. Between 400 and 500 points, I think you should be taking Brorgir and filling up the warbands of the Emperor as much as possible and giving a few warriors to Brorgir. Between 550, 650, I think this is the area where I really like having the captain. It's just a few extra points of mice, a little bit of extra killing power for not too much investment. This is an extra warband to deploy, and you really need it because just maxing out the Emperor's warband and Brorgir's warband doesn't give you enough points, to reach these point levels. But it's also a level where if you start adding Rutabi into the mix, your model count drops a little bit too much for my liking. So this is the point level where I really like the captain. And like I mentioned earlier, I don't like Dragon Knights anymore because they just die against good opponents. They know how to counter them. One Dragon Knight isn't scary. Dragon Knights are scary when you bring 2, or even better, bring 3 Dragon Knights to the table. That's when they become good. And in the Legendary Legion, you're just simply not doing that. It's not that kind of list. So at 700 to 800 points, I would swap the captain out for Rutabi. This is the point level where you can more easily slot her in and really also gain the benefit from Master of Battle and really get that extra might going on. And if you're going at 850 or above, I simply would not play the Legendary Legion. This is a bit of a hot take. It will easily scale higher and higher, just add more Dragon Knights or something. But I think you shouldn't. Because it's a very one-dimensional army list. It does one thing and it does it well, and it's just grinding shield wall to shield wall. And above a certain points level, that doesn't really scale anymore. And you'll start seeing things like a whole bunch of eagles, LSR on the table, really big scary units and heroes like Mumakil or whatever. And standard pike blocks just don't really work. They just get torn apart by these really powerful effects, and you don't have powerful effects of your own to really counter it. So you're just a punching bag for the opponent's big expensive toys, and they'll still have enough numbers behind it because you're playing at such a high points level that you can't just sit on the objective and be like, I'm gonna win because I have way more models than you. Like, guess what? They still have a decent amount of models. So once they get rid of half of your army, they'll actually outnumber you on the objective. So I think an example 650 point list, like I mentioned, for me would be the Emperor, it would be Brorgir, and it would be a captain without a shield. I would give the Emperor 15 warriors, 5 with axes and 10 with pikes. I would give him a cataphract with a drum and an axe swap, a regular cataphract with an axe swap, all of them black dragons of course. And I think in Brorgir and the Captain's Warband, I would give them both a few acolytes, maybe like 4 or 5 each, and behind them some regular pikes. Not black dragons because they don't get the upgrade for free, but the acolytes already have the fight value bonus anyways. So that's kind of how I would build my list at 650, and at the different points levels it would be mostly the same. Now, last list building section is not about the Legendary Legion, but it's about what do you do when you're not bringing the Legendary Legion. Now, you're bringing the Legendary Legion when you're taking the Emperor most of the times, but there are a few very good reasons why you might consider leaving the Legion behind. Like I mentioned before, like the bonuses for the Legion are good, but they're not incredibly good. You don't get penalized incredibly heavily for not taking the Legion. It's more that you want to take the Emperor and the heroes that are in the Legion anyway, so you might as well take the Legion. So there's 2 scenarios where you want to not take the Legion. The first one is where you want to take Amdur or Khamul. I guess you could do that. Personally, I don't think that's the most competitive option anymore. I love my boy Khamul, I've played him a lot, but I simply think that the combination of Brorgir and the Emperor is better than Khamul and anything else, so I personally wouldn't take him anymore. Which leaves the other option, and that's allies. Obviously you can't take the Legendary Legion if you want to take allies, and I do think the Eastlings make a decent ally for some other armies out there, most notably Khand and Mordor. Now Khand is a very natural ally because it's the only green ally that, Eastlings are the only green ally for Khand. So basically you take Easterlings in Khand if you want to have chariots, but you also want to have some numbers. Some decent warriors and not shitty warriors. Sorry, regular Khand warriors, but you suck. So yeah, if you want chariots and you want to play semi-competitively, you ally them in with Easterlings. But the main ally for Eastlings is Mordor. There's no real other ally that you should need to look at, because Mordor has everything that you could want in an ally as an Eastlings, and they're green allies, so you get to keep all of your shiny bonuses. Now, Mordor obviously has a lot of choices to them, a lot of troops, a lot of heroes. I'm not going to go over all of them, but why would you ally Eastlings into Mordor? Because it's quite obvious why you would take Mordor and add them to Eastlings, right? You get Morannon orcs for strength 4, or ring race for extra magic or things like that. You can add a great beast of Gorgoroth for some like line breaking capacity. Like these are all really good things to have in the Eastling army. But you could also have those things if you're just playing a pure Mordor list. So why would you ally? What do Eastlings bring to Mordor that Mordor doesn't have on its own? Well, it's 5/5. The Emperor still works, right? Even outside of the Legion, you can take the Emperor, you still can get 5/5 on Black Dragons. Sure, you have to pay extra points for them, but it could be worth it. Also, the 12-inch banner for the Emperor works on everyone, not just Easterlings. So you could just have the Emperor sitting in the middle of an army of Mordor orcs, and every single one of those Mordor orcs will just get a banner reroll because the Emperor is within range. And also, I've talked about them a lot, but there's Brorgir. And Brorgir is a hero of fortitude, which is enough for a green alliance. If you want to, you could just bring some acolytes and Brorgir, and suddenly have this hit squad in your Mordor list for funsies, and just run around tremoring things and blowing them up, and have Cardush throw fireballs at the same time, and have a Ringwraith throw transfixes, and just make your opponent's life absolutely miserable with all these annoying casters, and still have some solid warriors there. Let's see. Yeah, and the last thing, and this is a bit of a little spice alert, the Defense of the North also released these 2 new Mordor heroes, the Spellcaster, which is Musgur, and Razgush, which is the War Leader of the North. And now, the last one is really interesting because it lets you take Bat Swarms in your Mordor army. And you know what Bat Swarms combine really well with? It's 5/5 and fight 6 heroes. And Mordor has a few of those, but Eastlings have more of them. So suddenly you could have Rutabi, Amdur, Dragonites combined with Bat Swarms and just automatically winning any fight they're into. So that could be a very interesting list to play as well. Is it competitive? Maybe in the hands of the right player. I don't think it's the strongest option, but I think it could do really well if you know what you're doing. Of course, the Eastlings also have plenty of yellow ally options, but as I mentioned, I just don't think they're worth it. I think Mordor has anything you need as an ally, and because it's a green alliance, there's no reason to go for any of the other options unless you're trying to get some like really spicy combo going, but I won't really go over those. All right, you've made it this far. If you're not an Eastling player, this is the part of the video that's the most interesting for you. How do you beat Eastlings? I get it, like, this is an imposing army to face against, especially if your army is a bit of a vanilla army, like you just have some solid heroes and some good warriors, and your plan is just, to fight your opponent and try to figure out how you're going to get the objective. This is a really hard army to fight. But there are things that you can do to increase your chances of beating the host of the Dragon Emperor. So let's dive into it. The most important thing, and I can't stress this enough, is don't fight on the Eastling player's terms. Sometimes you can't avoid it. There are scenarios where you have to go to the middle and you have to face this pike block, and because they have a drum, they're faster than you and they can choose, a location. But if you can avoid it, don't let them pick a nice bottleneck and just, sit there and charge into them. Go around it, try to spread them out, try to position in such a way that a part of their army can't see the Emperor anymore and doesn't get the banner bonuses. This army works the best when everything's like in the same-ish place and all get the buffs and stuff, and if you can prevent that, you'll have a better shot at defeating them. Now, you might just have to give up the center objective. You might just have to go for the side objectives, even if they're worth less VPs. You might still be able to get a win if you get both of them. It really depends on the scenario and the way the board is set up. Now, if you've listened to the rest of the video, you know how much I love Brorgir. So if you're trying to beat the Eastlings, be really careful with Brorgir. Don't feed him easy tremors. If your Easterling opponent is leaving a gap in their lines and Brorgir is somewhere behind it, be mindful that Brorgir could just slip through that gap, cast a tremor, and just beat back out again. Kind of similar to preventing a really good hurl setup from your opponent, or getting hit by siege engines like the ballista. You might want to like space out your troops so that they don't get maximum value from the tremors that they do cast. One thing that can actually beat the Easterlings quite reliably is a horde. Like if you have a whole bunch of models and you can just envelop the Easterling players so they don't get their pikes anymore and all of their models are trapped and things like that, even if they have rerolls, if they lose fights they start dying and eventually you'll be able to chip away at them. So hordes can actually be something that the Easterlings struggle with if they're not in a bottleneck and if the horde can go around them. So you might have to, lure the Easterlings out towards you while some other models go around until you can get that envelop off and traps off. Just bide your time, fight for that position, and fight on your terms, not on the Easterling players' turns. A horde that has access to strength 4 is especially powerful at dealing with Eastlings because you wound and thighs. I'm looking at you, Goblin Town, with picks and piercing strike. You suck, go away. Another thing that will really ruin Eastlings' days is powerful shooting, if it can keep shooting. So evil armies that have good shooting, that can kind of tag up Eastlings in an awkward spot and just shoot into combats and do a bunch of wounds, maybe kill their own guys, but also kill a bunch of Eastlings. So I'm talking about crossbows. So this is basically Umbar and especially Uruk-hai in the Legendary Legion for some other reasons as well, which I'll mention in a minute. Strength 4 shooting is just scary. Shooting in general works well on the Eastlings because they won't shoot back, but on the other hand, Eastlings have drums, so they will move forward and you only get so many rounds of shooting. Don't fall into the trap of thinking, oh, I can just sit in the back and shoot them a bunch, because they will be in your face in a turn or two, and if you are an elf and you have strength 3 shooting, you're still only winning on 6s, so you won't have done that much damage with shooting. So use your shooting to lure the Eastling players into a bad position. Don't use your shooting to try and kill them, because that won't work. Another thing that works really well against Eastlings is siege engines. This shouldn't really be a surprise. The Emperor can get insta-killed by a siege engine if he somehow fails all fate, but more importantly, he'll just get thrown off the palanquin by a direct hit from a siege engine. This is really good because the palanquin kind of buffs the entire army, and just getting rid of that is just, it's nice, it's really good. Another thing that siege engines do really well is mess up formations, and Eastlings are the kings of formation. They have these really nice pike block, and if you throw a rock into it or shoot a ballista bolt through it, then you really mess up their day. You force them to spread out, you force them to get into cover or other spots, and it gives you control over the Eastlings instead of the Eastlings having control over you. So siege engines are really strong, and siege engines combined with strength 4 shooting is exactly the reason why Assault upon Helm's Deep is such a hard counter for the Eastlings. If I'm up against Assault on Helm's Deep and I know my opponent is a good player, I know it's going to be a really tough match. I will still do my best to win, but I also have to, face the fact that I might just lose the game simply because their army matches up really well. Strength 4, Fight 4, which ties me once the banner of the palanquin is gone, rerolling siege engines that will dismount the Emperor and mess up my formation, a bomb that can take out the Emperor and any heroes that are nearby. They just have all of the answers that they need to really crack open the Eastling line, and you don't have that many tricks to deal with them other than maybe trying to use Brorgir to kill the bomb berserker, if he's still alive after all of the crossbow shots have gone into him. I don't know. Oh, that's another tip, by the way. If you can, shoot Brorgir and kill him. Brorgir is scary. Now, another thing that will really help against Eastlings is the same things that Eastlings really like having on their side. It's ways to deal with defense 6 warriors, hurls, tremors, if you have Black Shield Shamans, for example, a Wrath of Brunnen to knock down the pike line after, and then charge into it, if you're a Rivendell Knight player. All of these things can really help mess up the formation. Another thing that can be really good against Eastlings is having fight 6 heroes. Avoid the Eastling heroes in such a case. Just tag up the Eastling heroes with your warriors and use your heroes to just kill 2-3 Eastling models a turn and just, you know, kill them, and eventually the tide will turn into your favor in terms of numbers. Maybe the Eastling player starts breaking and you can win that way. If your heroes aren't fight 6 but they are maybe fight 5 and they have strike, it's tough. The Eastling player will just tie you on 5 value with your hero, and the Emperor has higher 5 value than you. Don't waste your might on strikes against the Emperor if you can't do enough damage. Bide your time, and maybe if the Emperor is in a bad spot, you can flash kill him or maybe flash kill a palanquin and turn the tide in your favor that way. Now, about striking on a palanquin. Striking on a palanquin can be a bit of a trap. Striking the palanquin doesn't do anything unless you do 5 wounds or more. Sorry, 4 wounds or more. Yes, 4 wounds or more. If the palanquin's been brought down to 2 wounds, he only moves half. If he's been brought down to 1 wound, he doesn't move at all anymore. And if you kill all of the bearers, obviously the Emperor has to dismount and the banner is gone. Now, it can be beneficial to strike at the palanquin if, for example, you're strength 4. So the palanquin, you get wounds on 5s and on the Emperor on 6s. And you have enough dice that you think you might be able to, you know, kill the palanquin in one go, then maybe go for it. But in that case, you're also likely to be able to do at least 1 wound through the fate of the Emperor on him, and that could be worth victory points. So striking on the palanquin can be a bit of a trap. If, let's say, like this happened to me in a tournament recently, I was up against 2 hunter orcs with my Emperor. They're strength 4, they have 2 attacks each, and I whiffed my combat roll on day 1. They had strength 4, so they have 4 dice, winning the palanquin on 5s and winning the Emperor on 6s. My opponent decided to roll on the palanquin, and he did 3 wounds on the palanquin, which is nice. You know, 3 wounds is significant, but he didn't do any other wounds on the palanquin for the entire game, and the Emperor just didn't care. He still moved 6 inches. Sure, he did less palanquin hits after winning a fight, but most of the time his strength 4 with 3 hits was enough to kill anyway, so he didn't do anything. But if he had rolled to wound on the Emperor and rolled at 6, now suddenly I'm having to spend my fate. I might fail my fate rolls and have to burn a might in order to make sure that he doesn't get a leader wound, and that could have gotten him a VP. Whereas the palanquin was just, you know, a juicy target, but not worth anything at that point, and then ultimately didn't impact the game. So don't be lured into the trap of striking on the palanquin when it's not necessary. Now, what you can do against the Emperor when you don't have a way of dealing with him directly is simply just tie him up. The Emperor has an absolutely almighty fat ass, and he's not going to go anywhere if the lines are like messy and congested and there's like models everywhere. He'll just not be able to move. So just send a single warrior in, accept that that warrior is probably going to die, but at least the Emperor is not doing anything else that turn, and you can focus on killing the rest of the army. That's another way you can deal with it. Now, a final word of warning: don't rely on a game ending if it's a scenario where you have to roll for it. You might be clever and get onto objectives before the Eastling player because you have marches or a bunch of cavalry or something, and you'll be like, yeah, I've got these objectives, I'm going to win as soon as the game ends. All I need to do now is break myself and then I just win. Well, you know, the Eastling player still has the army bonus, so they can just reroll whenever it ends, and it becomes incredibly unlikely. So in most times, the game will go on for like 3 turns or more after you break, and by that time, if the Eastern player is any good at what they're doing, the rest of your troops will have run away, and suddenly they will be on the objectives and they'll win the game from there. So that's not a game plan that I would recommend anyone trying, unless that's really the only shot that you have at winning. So that's it. I know it's been a long watch. I'm certainly slightly sore from talking. But it's, you know, it's a fun army. I really love the Eastlings. I love talking about them. I hope you learned something from this video, or are excited to try playing them, or, you know, maybe slightly less scared of facing against them in your next match. And as always, if you disagreed with anything that I said, well, I'm not perfect, I'm just human, but I would like to hear your opinion, just leave a comment down below. If you enjoyed the video, you learned something, maybe leave us a like or a subscribe. It really helps us. We just make these videos out of our love for the game and our love for the community. So I really hope you liked it, and that's all for now. See you next time at Lowlands Wargaming.